Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with brain scientist Uri Maoz about the neurophilosophy of free will. We ask about the role of neuroscience in the free will debate, how philosophers and neuroscientists can collaborate, and more.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Uri Maoz, Assistant Professor of Computational Neuroscience and Psychology at Chapman University. Uri's research looks at the intersection of volition, decision-making, and moral choice. In addition to using empirical methods such as EEG and intracranial recordings, Uri's work includes theoretical modeling of what takes place when a person performs a voluntary action. And he's worked with philosophers, including several times with Gideon Yaffe, who specializes in the philosophy of law, on various implications of his empirical and theoretical work, including legal and economic implications. So I could say a lot more, but I'll just note one more aspect of Uri's work in introducing him, which we'll talk about with him later in the interview. And that's that Uri is the project leader for the Neurophilosophy of Free Will project, which we'll say more about. So welcome to the show, Uri. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on these issues that are related to free will?
Well, thank you for having me. I think, well, you asked me about myself. I have been exercising free will since birth, I think. I can talk to my parents. I was thinking, you asked me about, you mentioned philosophers and neuroscience, and I was trying to think, where was I first exposed to neuroscience? It was probably at high school. We had this strange guy who came in and said he's going to teach us philosophy. And it was, it was interesting. It was the first time I've really been exposed to this kind of thinking. And I remember actually after high school, at some point, I thought, I don't remember what the thought was, but I thought it was a really deep thought and really profound philosophical thought. And I was quite proud of myself for thinking it. And then I happened to read Socrates and realize that he thought it 2,500 years before me, which was really, really disappointing. And I think this has led me to maybe understand that I probably won't be a philosopher, but it has given me deep respect for philosophy. In my undergrad, I did a degree in computer science and in general humanistic studies, and I did study some philosophy as part of that, and just more generally in university. And later on, let's see, I did my PhD at the Hebrew University and at the Weizmann Institute. And you asked where I started with free will. So I think there's actually a bit of an interesting story there. So my undergrad, there was this, as I mentioned, this general humanistic, it was a program called the Amirim at the Hebrew University, and it's like a general humanistic studies thing. And so you study all these weird courses that they throw at you, there's a 3-year course in literature, and there's a course in law, and there's a course in anthropology, and a lot of different things. Graduates of the program can be TAs in those courses. And they don't necessarily, the graduates, maybe they're doing their PhD in computer science, but they're TAing a course in law. So in my case, it was, I was doing my PhD in neuroscience, and they assigned me to be the TA in a course on some introduction to law. And, it was interesting to hear it again, and it was fun. And then at some point, the instructor came and said, "Look, I'm going to a conference in 2 weeks, and I want you to give that class." And I said, "You do know that my PhD is in neuroscience. What do you want me to teach about?" He said, "Well, anything that you want, as long as it's related to law." So I was trying to think, what can I talk about between this neuroscience and would be of any interest to these people who are going to come and want to, learn about something related to the law. And I thought to myself, well, I can maybe talk about free will because it has to somehow be instantiated in the brain. and I started reading about that. And I think maybe I had like 2 or 3 weeks, so I couldn't have done that much reading, but I did give a presentation about that, and honestly, I caught the bug. So that has really changed the
Nice.
trajectory of my. I mean, I did my PhD in motor control initially, and I just really became more interested in, well, how do we make these decisions that lead to these actions rather than how do we control the actions after they. So
Mhm.
that's how it all started. And I mean, then
Nice.
through Caltech and UCLA, I ended up where I am now, really studying this as my main field.
Very cool. So you're our first guest on the Free Will Show that isn't a professional philosopher. But as Taylor mentioned, we know that you've collaborated with philosophers. How did you come to be interested in working with philosophers as a neuroscientist?
Um, so it started again with that when I became interested in free will. Um, I was doing a lot of TAing because as you probably know too, you need the cash um, as a grad student. And I was also TAing another course, actually with a philosopher as the instructor. His name is Gabriel Motzkin. And when I started getting interested in free will, I started talking to him, and I started talking to the professor who was teaching the course on law, and trying to get their perspective. And so that's how I started it. But after that, so that same philosopher, so Gabriel Motzkin, known as Gabby, um, he went on to to direct something called the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which is this. It's like a research institute in Jerusalem. And after I finished my PhD, he asked me, "Well, could you put together a group of people who would like meet once a month and discuss free will? We're interested in that." And they were even, I think, they gave like each member $100 or so. It was like very small, like a honorarium or something to come to these things. Um, so it was mainly a bunch of young people, and we met once a month and started talking about free will. And I put together philosophers and psychologists and neuroscientists and sociologists, and um, it was fun. And I got to meet some other philosophers. And I think the thing that really happened, so there's a paper from the lab of John Dylan Haynes by Soon et al. 2008 that claimed to have claimed to show that you could predict whether a person's going to raise their right hand or their left hand up to 10 seconds before they move. And I was doing this. I was part of this group. I was leading this group at Van Leer Institute when this thing came out, and I got so excited about it. And a lot of neuroscientists did. And I went to one of the members of the group. He just happened to stay behind. He's a philosopher. His name is Ram Rivlin. He's now a professor at the Hebrew University. And he saw me reading this thing, getting really excited. And he said, "So what are you reading?" And I tried to explain to him, "Hey, this thing, you can predict whether the person's going to raise their right hand or their left hand, uh, 10 seconds in advance, and it's really exciting. And it suggests maybe free will is an illusion, things like that." And then he said, "Well, no, I don't get it. Explain again." So I said, "Okay." I went in and I explained the whole thing, and it took 20 minutes, and I showed him all the fMRI this and the computational that, and they said, I no, I still don't get what the big deal is." I said, "Okay, I'm sorry, I'm really explaining this badly. Let me try again." And then, basically within about 5 minutes, he convinced me that there is no real big deal there, that there could be, under very, very strict assumptions, that I mean, there is no reason to think that those are warranted at that point, at least.
Hmm.
And that honestly was, again, this kind of like a watershed moment for me personally, or professionally, because I thought to myself, wow, so I could be spending the next 20 years of my life as a neuroscientist doing all these, all this research on what I think is free will. And then a philosopher can convince me in 5 minutes that everything that I did was not about not asking the right question. And I did not want to live a life of regret and find myself, thinking that my career was all in vain in 20 years. So I thought I might as well talk to these people. If you can't beat them, join them, right? So I
Yeah.
might as well talk to these people, and that is, I mean, that's what I've been doing ever since.
Cool.
That's awesome. Well, we're going to ask some specific questions about your work in a bit, but we thought we'd ask at the beginning some big picture questions about the place of neuroscience in the free will debate. So, what are some ways that the findings of neuroscience can bear on questions of free will?
Um, I think that neuroscience started out with the Libet experiment and the like, just trying to decide the free will debate in one fell swoop. And like, oh, we're going to do an experiment, and
Mm-hmm.
we're going to show that we do or don't have free will, something like that. Um, in all honesty, after looking at this now for a few years, I do not think that there is any single neuroscientific experiment that would decide this millennia long question. Um, I don't also think. I mean, one maybe cornerstone of the free will debate is, of course, the question of its compatibilism with determinism. And I don't think that neuroscience could discover whether free will is compatible with determinism. Whether it's physicalism, idealism, or dualism that really holds, or anything like that. I guess you guys are starting to think, why did we invite this person? He doesn't think neuroscience is communicating with anything. But well, I do think that neuroscience can elucidate mechanisms, neural mechanisms, and one way that I like to think about the free will debate, and this is something developed together with my colleague at Chapman, philosopher Michael Robinson, was that you can think about the free will debate as, or the question of do we have free will, you can think about it as divided into two different questions. One is, what would it take for, so the question is, do humans have free will, right? And then, so I think you divide it into, what would it take for humans to have free will? That's one question. The second question is, well, do we have that? Whatever that is. And if you think about it that way, then the first question is a philosophical question. What would it take? There's not an experiment that I or any other neuroscientist can do to answer that. What it would take. But then, okay, once we agree on that this is whatever it is that it would take, then, well, do we have that or not? I think neuroscience can help with that. So I think that the free will debate is inherently a collaboration between neuroscientists and philosophers. At least that's how I see it.
Nice.
Yeah. So it's inherently this kind of collaboration that you said. Could you say a little bit more about the role of this sort of collaboration, and like what the benefits and challenges are to collaborating with different disciplines?
Yes, I've thought quite a bit about that. So looking from the perspective of neuroscience, I would say that in recent years, neuroscience has started getting more into abstract concepts, emotions, consciousness, volition. Um, when you deal with such concepts, conceptual clarity is key. You can probably study. I mean, if you're studying some channel in some type of neurons, then you could probably stick electrodes in a rat, study it in humans, whatever it is that you do, and just look at that channel, and you don't need to sit and think, well, what is a channel, what is a neuron, or how do neural receptors act in a channel from a philosophical perspective. These are more scientific questions. But if you want to ask, if you want to study free will in a meaningful manner, as I kind of alluded to before, you have to understand more about these concepts. And I think that historically, when neuroscientists started with the Libet experiment and other things like it to look at this, they kind of took um, their lay concepts and studied those. And again, as I said before, I think that's a problem. So I think philosophers can really help neuroscientists direct the questions. So what questions should we ask? Then once we have some data, there's the interpretation. Okay, so no experiment is going to be perfect. Again, no experiment is going to study everything. But okay, so what can we take from that? So I think again, that's where philosophers and neuroscientists can work together. Okay, we got these results. What do these results mean? Of course, philosophers cannot help neuroscientists, I don't know, analyze the data, find the best controls, stick the EEG with the gel just right to get clean signals and things like that. But before the experiment starts and after the experiment starts before the experiment starts and after we get the data at the end of the experiment, I think that's where the collaboration is very fruitful. So this is what neuroscientists get. I think philosophers get something as well from this collaboration. So first of all, neuroscience sometimes produces data that bears on philosophical questions. So many of my collaborations with Gideon Yaffe started with some questions that Gideon was interested in and had an empirical aspect to them, so that we studied those together. So and also I would say that neuroscience can sometimes, so it can enrich philosophical debates. It can also sometimes constrain them by saying, well, that can't be. So, I mean, you could think about it theoretically, but this is how the brain is configured in that way, or this is what we've learned that really constrains the debate. So these are the benefits. The challenges are many. First, there is sometimes you see that there's this basic distrust. Some philosophers would tell you that neuroscience cannot contribute to the free will debate, quote unquote, on first principles. First time I heard it from a philosopher, I didn't even know what it means. But basically, that the questions are theoretical in nature. The philosophical questions are theoretical in nature, and any data that neuroscientists collect is going to be meaningless to answer those questions. The flip side of that, some neuroscientists would tell you quite bluntly, philosophers have had 25 centuries to elucidate the concept of free will. They have obviously failed. Now move aside and let neuroscientists do our job and stop interfering from the sidelines by shouting things like, you don't know what you're studying, all your concepts are really messed up and things like that.
Right.
Also, there's a conception in neuroscience that philosophy does not make progress. It seems like maybe it just goes around in circles. To the best of my understanding at this point, this is wrong. As far as I can, again, I'm not a philosopher, but as far as I can tell, clear progress has been made on the free will debate in philosophy, and it's just a wrong opinion. And I mean, another thing to take into account. So neuroscientists always say things like data is the framing is data is king. I think we might want to find a more gender neutral expression now, but still, data is key. Let's put it like that. Okay. And it all centers around the data, and you could have the best hypothesis in the world, but if it doesn't stand up to empirical scrutiny, it falls. And as neuroscientists, we have data, and then those really insistent tell the joke of the president of the university that the physicist comes in, right? This is a well-known one. The physicist comes in and asks for another $5 million for some kind of small particle accelerator. It's probably $5 billion at this point, but whatever it is. And then the president of the university says, "You physicists, you always want so much money. Why can't you be more like the mathematicians? They come in, they ask for some paper, some pencils, and some erasers. Better yet, what about the chair of philosophy? He just wants papers and pencils." So, and I think I think that's sometimes the view of neuroscientists towards philosophers, at least until they start working together. I think then it's much easier to understand the value. But so anyway, that's the first challenge of this mistrust. Then um, there's this thing where, you know how sometimes people say that the only worst thing than not knowing something at all is knowing a little bit about something. And that's sometimes a
Right.
problem in both directions. So some neuroscientists know something about philosophy when they start talking to philosophers, and they might think that they know more, and vice versa. And this
Mhm.
happens, I don't know, a neuroscientist took a course in high school in philosophy, and then they say, oh, okay, philosophy is what you do when you've had one too many and you're trying to impress some significant other or something like that. Or and again, it could happen the other way around. Philosophers might think that they know more about neuroscience than they do, and of course, both disciplines are very intricate and so on. I think, I mean, actually, philosophers. So it's more neuroscientists that tend to think that they're good philosophers than philosophers that tend to think that they're just these amazing neuroscientists. And it's probably because neuroscience has all these tools that, unless you master them and you really know how to do EEG and how to analyze fMRI and all those things, it's very easy to know that you don't know. And I think that sometimes for neuroscientists,
Right.
like, well, philosophers, they just sit there and talk, so I can do that. But what does happen to philosophers is, for instance, so they sit there and they talk with a neuroscientist for half a year and they design this amazing experiment. And then the philosopher says, okay, so uh, the neuroscientist says, okay, I'm going to do it now. And then, a month passes, 2 months, 3 months, a year and a half. And then the philosopher, calls up his neuroscience friend and says, what's going on? He says, yeah, I got it by the ethics committee and I'm going to recruit a student very soon to start running the experiment. I'm kidding, but it could really happen that 2 years later you come back with the results. And as a
Right.
philosopher, you don't usually need 2 years to start to, if you have an idea, you can develop it. It doesn't take, you
Right.
don't need to recruit an RA and all that stuff. So that sometimes you get frustrations from the philosophers. Another thing is philosophers and neuroscientists sometimes speak or often speak different languages. They mean different things by the same. I mean, they use the same they use the same word, but it's actually it means something
Hmm.
different in the different fields. It really takes a long time for philosophers and neuroscientists or for a philosopher and a neuroscientist to sit together and develop common language that would have enabled them to talk to each other and not past each other.
Hmm.
So with Ram Rivlin, I mentioned him before. This person who convinced me within 5 minutes that everything that my future career was doomed. Um, he and I would sit. So I was at that point in the U.S. He was in Israel. I would like, given the time differences, we would sit really late at night here. So like 11 p.m. here would be 9 a.m. in Israel, and we would sit into the night and try to talk about things. And he would say, well, okay, there's this really complex computational model. I don't know differential equations, but just explain to me what it does. And it was always a challenge, but I was always better for it afterwards, being able to explain it to somebody without, I mean, it's very easy to say, hey, just look at the math. It's there. But what does all this mean? So, and the same then, I mean, for like, Alan Ribin came here once for a week and we just spent a whole week trying to think about things together and understand it and so on. Then it was a similar process with Gideon Yeffi. When we started working together, we would have these breakfasts and lunches, try to think and talk and understand. And then I did it again with Pamela Hieronymi at UCLA. Um, we would meet at the faculty center, have lunch, and talk and understand. And again, it's this process that takes a long time. In my opinion, it's worth it, but it's that. And then the last thing I would say that's a challenge is that the career incentives are quite different. So books and book
Hmm.
chapters count for a lot in the career of a philosopher. They count. I mean, book chapters count for very little in the career especially a starting neuroscientist. Books maybe count for more, but not that much more. Um, Grants mean much more to neuroscientists. They have to feed a lab. It's very hard to do neuroscience on your own. It's typically done with the help of graduate students and postdocs. These people strangely like to eat, so you need to give them salary. Um,
Imagine that.
yeah, we're working on those versions of. just not meat to eat. But it seems like almost when we're
Right.
just successful, they die off, the grad students. But we lower the food intake little by little. Anyway, more seriously, of course. So it means that grants are critical in neuroscience.
Right.
Scientists typically work in teams with their students, with others, and philosophers seem to be notorious for working alone, not even with their, it's like they don't even work with their students, which is still weird to me after all these years. Like, so you're guiding this person for a PhD, but you don't sit with them all the time and talk. No, they work on their own, and they come to me sometimes with questions, and I work on my own. And philosophers like to work at home, so even if you're in the same university, you rarely see them. So there are many challenges, but again, I think it's all worth it in the end if you overcome them. Long answer, sorry.
Yeah, no, that was
that's
great.
great. That'll kind of lead into some of your other answers, I'm sure. But our next question we wanted to ask was about any specific collaborations that you've done. You've talked about some here and there, but did you want to go into any more detail about maybe one or two of the collaborations you've done with a philosopher?
Yeah, there's a paper that was published, actually now almost 2 years ago, with Gideon Yaffe as the philosophy collaborator, also with Liad Mudrik of Tel Aviv University as the neuroscience collaborator, and also with Christoph Koch, who was my postdoc supervisor at Caltech. And so it has to do, still going back to the Libet experiment. In the Libet experiment, there are various versions of it, and let's describe one that would be useful for us in this case. So maybe you're sitting there and you're told, whenever you feel like it, say, raise your right hand or your left hand, whenever you want to. Then at the same time, you get the person, and they're looking at some kind of a clock that keeps on changing on the screen. So maybe a rotating dot or changing letters or something. And then after you raise whichever it is, your right hand or your left hand, you have to say what was the time on that clock when you first had the urge to move. And during all this time, they record EEG, or there have been versions of fMRI, whatever, but they record your neural activity. And the surprising thing about the Libet experiment is that you can see from the neural activity something that seems to be leading up to a movement. You can see some kind of preparation in the brain to move long before people say that they have had the urge to move, that they decided to move, whatever. And that is a bit of a puzzle, because wait, if the information was in the brain, but the person didn't know about it consciously, so does that mean that this decision was made unconsciously? And from that, does that mean that maybe all decisions were made unconsciously? So if that's the case, then maybe we really don't have free will, at least according to some definitions, and then that's problematic in various ways. So that's the Libet experiment in a nutshell. We took stock specifically, or we had an issue. I maybe just put it differently. We had an issue with this idea that, well, maybe decisions in this experiment were done unconsciously, and that's a big maybe, because there are many problems with the Libet experiment. But let's assume for a moment that we think it's all good, and decisions in that experiment were really made unconsciously. So does that mean the decisions generally are made unconsciously? Now, so the fact that if you're just told to raise one of your hands for no reason and no purpose, and you can look into the brain and see that there's something there beforehand, and before you consciously make up your mind, I would actually say that it's hard to sit there for an hour and just consciously deliberate all the time about whether I want to raise my right hand or my left hand. Who cares? Right? It's not. These are. It's. I've done the Libet experiment a few times. The main thing that's hard for me is just not falling asleep when I do all this. It's so it's such a repetitive task. So we were thinking, well, we know. These arbitrary decisions, or sometimes they're called picking. What happens to when you do more deliberate decisions? Again, sometimes called choosing. Mm-hmm. Is it going to be the same? So we wanted to directly compare between arbitrary and deliberate decisions. So we had this, and for instance, okay, we started, Liad and I should say, Liad actually has she's one of those underachieving persons with 2 PhDs, one in neuroscience and one in philosophy. So it's not that she lacks philosophical training.
Nice.
But we started thinking about how do we do this, and we started thinking about food. So Liad has strong preferences about chocolate, so we thought maybe we should do food. And then Gideon came into the picture, and he was saying, well, no, let's look at something that has some ethical implications. Let's look at like donations. Usually the charities that you donate to say something about your preferences, and then we actually had some help from Ralph Adolphs at Caltech as well in this. But we ended up with this paradigm where people make donations. So we took in advance. We took people who care about social issues and vote and volunteer and so on. So this was like a prerequisite. And then we asked them how much do they want to donate $1,000 to these following nonprofits. And then we took those nonprofits and we said, okay, now you have, I don't know, save the trees, save the whales. To which one of those do you want to donate $1,000? And we said it, and it was true that this donation would be real. So we would take one choice of one of these people, and we would make that donation in their name. And we wanted to do that so that people would take it seriously and they would not just arbitrarily decide. And we also we did one version or one type of trial were these deliberate trials. Again, you get these two nonprofits. Whichever one you decide is the one that might get this $1,000 from you. Then these more arbitrary trials, we told the subject, well, these trials, no matter what you decide, no matter which button you press, both of these nonprofits will get 500. So it doesn't matter. It's arbitrary. So then we wanted to compare, and we were able to compare directly between arbitrary and deliberate decisions. In the arbitrary case, we got the results that look much like the Libet experiment. We got this thing that the Libet found, which is called the readiness potential, which is this that's been associated with preparing to move. But when we looked at deliberate decisions, we did not really see a readiness potential. And we think that this puts, so people who before just said, well, and you can see this in 1985, this is like 2 years after the original Libet experiment, there was a brain and behavioral science, this long paper with Libet and a lot of commentaries. And already in that experiment, Libet says, well, I got these results, therefore, all the decisions are made unconsciously. And then he goes on to talk about moral responsibility and things like that, how it's a challenge for that. Mm-hmm. Well, we were trying to say, well, look, after our results, the onus is on the people claiming that these arbitrary decisions generalize to deliberate ones, rather than just, you can't just assume, look, this is going to happen because see what we got. And that would not have been the way it was without Gideon's help. So he helped us design the experiment, and then 2 years later, when we finally had the data, we looked at the data together, and we were trying to think whether we need to run additional controls. We even talked about, some of the analyses that we later did were motivated by Gideon. And again, it's not that Gideon didn't sit there and program the computer to do these analyses, of course, but he was very, very much a part of the team. This would not have happened without him. So that's just an example. I mean, I did some other things with Pamela, this free will survey, but I mean, I think maybe that one is the one that's so far. I mean, there are some other ongoing projects with philosophers that I'm quite proud of, but the one that's been published, I think it's probably the one with Gideon is the one I'm proud of. The one with Pamela hopefully will come out soon, and then I can be more proud of that one too.
Yeah.
Nice.
Well, as someone who has collaborated with philosophers, do you have any advice for philosophers or scientists who are interested in future collaborations?
I think it's actually important to seek interdisciplinary training early. So, I mean, you can do that. You mentioned the neurophilosophy of free will. So we have a website where we have a lot of information about that. We have seminars that are always run by philosophers and neuroscientists together. You can come to those. If you're more serious, then, for instance, there's the SNAP program. I think it's summer seminars in neuroscience and philosophy that's run by Felipe de Brigard and Walter Sinnott Armstrong at Duke. or we have some interdisciplinary competitions that sometimes it's philosophers and neuroscientists apply together, or things like that. So, but I think it is important to start early. I mentioned all the challenges before, and the earlier you start, the more you could overcome them. It's important to understand what each person brings to the table in these collaborations. The neuroscientist should not. I mean, the goal should not be for the neuroscientist to become a philosopher or for the philosopher to become a neuroscientist. It sometimes happens. Sometimes you have, as a neuroscientist, sometimes I have philosophers saying, well, I did a PhD in philosophy, but I actually want to learn more about how to do EEG. And, sure, I'm happy to take somebody and train them, but that's a different type. I mean, these people would then bring their philosophical thinking and maybe become a neuroscientist. But if you really want to talk about collaboration, then it's the goal is not to transform one person into the other. There is, I think it's important to find a question that is of interest to both sides, is deep enough interest, because again, it's going to take a long time to talk to each other, to get to a situation where you're talking to each other and not past each other. And if both sides are not very committed, then it's going to be very hard to do. So I think it's, trying to find a question. Of course, you don't know if you're committed to a question until you start, but if you're not sure, don't go into a year-long conversation with a philosopher about something that philosopher gets really excited about, but you don't really understand why it's exciting after meeting for 2 months. So that's probably not a good idea. Again, I'm saying things are trivial, but it's still maybe worth saying. And again, you cannot expect a neuroscientist to go and read the entire Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, or a philosopher to sit there and read, with the Neuroscience Bible, Kendall and Schwartz or something like that. It's really the idea of you want to collaborate with each other and each bring something to the table.
You can't even expect a philosopher to read the entire Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
No, but you expect them to write some part of it, right? Yeah.
That's right.
And if it doesn't work the first time that you try, that doesn't necessarily mean that all philosophers don't know what they're talking about and so on. It just might have not been a good fit, that specific person you talked to, and take that into account. Try again, in my experience. You could also, if you really want to go, if you really want to go and do it, the best way perhaps is to try to get 2 PhDs. As I mentioned, there's some people who have done that, Adina Roskis, Liad Mudrik, Chandra Sripada, Marie Christine Nitzi are some of the people I know that have really tried to get a PhD in one of the more science or medicine or something like that, and also in philosophy. But that's if you're really committed. And then you don't have to collaborate with anybody. You can just collaborate with yourself. So that it lowers your travel budget.
Right.
Yeah. And I would say one last thing. I think that, as you see, there are not really easy ways right now, but we are working on it. And I'll give one last example. So so this is something that Pamela and I started at UCLA, is this course on the neuroscience and philosophy of free will. And then when I moved to Chapman, Michael Robinson and I have picked it up together. And we are trying to teach undergrads about both neuroscience and philosophy of free will. And then so we're exposing people much earlier in their career than I was exposed to these questions. And again, I think that's useful to do if you can find one of these courses, or try to get your university to create one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's all great. Thanks. Well, we've mentioned the Neurophilosophy of Free Will Project Consortium a few times. Would you like to say a bit more about that project?
Sure. So at some point, I think I mentioned Ralph Adolphs, who was one of my postdoc supervisors at Caltech. At some point, I got an email from him saying, hey, there are 2 strange Swedish people in town now that came to me to talk about free will. Well, he didn't say strange. But and I said that they should talk to you. You're the free will guy, or something like that. Of course, these people were Hans Lilienström and Alf Linderman. They were quite enthusiastic about creating some kind of a conference on free will. And it just happened to be that at the time I was thinking about this, that there is no real conference on the neuroscience and philosophy of free will, at least not one that I knew of. So neuroscientists and philosophers interested in free will would meet at the fringes of other conferences. Maybe one's on consciousness, one's on decision making. I mean, as a neuroscientist, you can go to there are many philosophy conferences on free will, but not ones that really try to bring neuroscientists and philosophers together. So when they talked about that, that was my pitch. I said, "Hey, yeah, I'd love to do it if we could put these neuroscientists and philosophers together." And we started organizing a conference in Sigtuna in Sweden. And it was really nice to see because I was emailing these people. Some of them I knew from textbooks, and some of them I've met before, but emailing these big names in neuroscience and philosophy of free will. And I said, hey, we're organizing this conference where we're going to bring neuroscientists and philosophers together. And the almost universal answer was, yes, how do I get there? How can I come? And it was really heartening to see that these people agree that, we don't usually get to meet each other and spend a few days together and sit and talk. Luckily for us, actually, there was a big conference already, I think it was in Berlin or in Bonn, I believe, that just ended maybe a day or two before we wanted to start our conference in Sigtuna. So a lot of it was a philosophy conference. I remember like Al Mealy and many other people were already there. So for them, it was like, yeah, we could stop by, Sigtuna on the way back. And it made it also, I remember, more manageable because the funding was not that abundant at the time. But anyway, we're sitting there in this conference, and for me, it's like a dream come true. I get to meet some of my heroes. I get to see again some others, and we're sitting and we're talking. And at some point, the Swedish have this thing they call a shrimp cruise or a shrimp boat or something like that, where basically they take all these conference people, they put them on a lake, and you eat shrimp until you can't shrimp anymore. And I remember I was sitting outside or standing outside somewhere, and somebody came to me and said, if this boat sinks now, then the neuroscience and philosophy of free will as a discipline will cease to exist because everybody's here. And I quickly looked around, and the lake was calm. And anyway, that has kind of made me think, hey, you know what? Everybody really is here, and it's so much fun. We have to do something to be able to work together more. Somehow more permanently or more frequently. And so I did what I usually do with these when I think I have a good idea. I first go to Liad and I say, do you also think it's a good idea? And she said, yeah, if you can make it happen, because you're talking about a lot of people, it's going to be a lot of money. So what do we do? So, well, we can go to the Templeton Foundation. So we had, I asked some people around like lunch and said, hey, let's sit and let's think about this. And the tragic error was, so I had, I think John Dylan Haynes was there, and Patrick Haggard, and Al, and again, a lot of people. I don't remember exactly who was around the table, but what I do remember is Patrick saying, so I was pitching my idea, and I was thinking one of these people from the textbooks is going to say, yeah, that's good, I'll lead this. And then Patrick looks at me and says, so it's a good idea, or I'm all in favor, but you're going to lead this, right? And I can go, yeah. And I didn't realize what I was signing up for. Trying to herd 17. It ended up being 17 people now that we had on this grant. So it's herding cats, right? And, if I would have known how many not sleepless, but 4-hour nights became the norm for a long time, and you can go on without sleep for a very long time, I've learned, although your family starts to like you less and less, apparently. So it's but anyway, so that's where we started, and we went, and I put what I really thought was one of the best groups that I could. I put all my heroes together in a team. I got them to sign off on this, and we applied to the Templeton Foundation. And I thought, they can't say no to this team. This is like the dream team of the neuroscience and philosophy of free will. And of course, they said no. So, and we got this like email saying something like, well, we appreciate something like looks like it's been sent by a machine. And then I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe this. It was so much work. And I'm the youngest one in the crowd. And I got all these really important people to read all that stuff that I was writing and these drafts and give me comments. And now we didn't even make it past their initial level. It's not that, because they have this, what do they call it, an OFI, like letter of intent. We didn't even get past that. And then a few minutes, so this my utter depression lasted for a few minutes until I got an email from John Churchill saying, "Well, we said no, but it's not that we don't like the idea. Let's work together towards an application for next year." And that was, then Templeton has these things about donor intent and so on. We didn't pitch it the right way. It was not, but they liked the idea. It was just not framed the way they wanted, and so on. So yeah, and finally we were successful. We even ended up putting more philosophers on the team, but we ended up with 17 philosophers, 8 neuroscientists, and the point really was collaboration on each and every project as part of this big project. And maybe the elevator pitch for that project was something like, does consciousness have a causal, or I'll put it differently, how does the brain enable conscious causal control of our decisions and actions? But all the sub projects here, all of them had neuroscientists and philosophers working together. And again, I was pleasantly surprised. I was worried that I would be, people would sign up for, yeah, sure, they'll get some money out of this. Why not sign up? But then when it comes to coming to a talk, to working on the project, that people would, it would be very difficult. But it never has been. It's like people really want to do this together. I think neuroscientists and philosophers now see the value of this collaboration, and the fact that there's a lot to be had from doing this, and it's people come with more ideas and more things we could do together, and so on. And it's been amazing, and I've really enjoyed this, and it seems that others do too, because we have our events and they seem to come, and so yeah.
That's great.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, we've talked a little bit about the Libet experiment. You've explained the basic idea, and we had an episode prior to this one where Tim Bain explained why he's not convinced that the Libet experiment disproves free will. Is it fair to say that his type of response is typical for philosophers familiar with Libet? And as a neuroscientist, I think we've already kind of gotten your idea, but can you make more explicit what you make of the experiment?
I should start by saying that while I have criticism of the Libet experiment, it is the seminal experiment in the field, and it casts a very long shadow to this day. So my, this work I'm so proud of is still a response to Libet. It's. I would even say, paraphrasing Christopher Marlowe, that this is the experiment that launched 1,000 studies, and it is in many ways a brilliant, I believe, experiment. That said, almost every aspect of it is problematic and wrong. Interestingly, so there is this BBS, this brain and behavior studies. So it's Libet laid out his claim, then a bunch of people, many of them philosophers, responded with commentaries, and then he responded to them. And much of the criticism against this experiment has been already laid in that 1985. It's a paper. It's like 70 pages long. It's a very long paper and commentaries and so on. But much of it has already been said then. And Michael and I now teach this as part of our neuroscience and philosophy of free will class. But every year when I read this, I go, like, these guys were so prescient. We're still working on for instance, my colleague at Chapman, Aaron Sugar, has done some really important work to show that the readiness potential might not be this readiness potential that the brain is preparing to move, but rather it could even be artifactual to the type of signal that EEG is, which is autocorrelated, and also the way we measure the readiness potential. We only stop when there's movement, and then we look what led to movement. So it's only like we would try to say what predicts rain. We would only stop when it rains, and then look what happened before that. But what about all those other days when when it didn't rain? What about, so it's like a one way anyway. Right. So he had this criticism against that, but even that, somebody already in that BBS said, well, shouldn't we look more into this readiness potential, because it seemed like, and so it's quite amazing to see how much was already said that early on. And I think one of the issues with the Libet experiment is that it's based on a very muddled concept of free will. It like Libet took his everyday concept of what free will is, which seems to be something somewhat libertarian, somewhat compatible. It's a bit of a mess. And
Mm-hmm.
later on, by the way, in life, Libet hated philosophers. You could see some of his correspondence. For him to call somebody so there was actually this his name was Golem or something. I'm sorry, I'm blanking out on the name, but like he actually defends himself saying, Libet called me a philosopher, but I'm actually a professor of psychology. It's like Libet, a philosopher, was like the worst insult because these people kept on saying that what he did was wrong, and they didn't even have data of their own. They just came there and they were complaining about his concepts, right? But anyway, so a lot of the concepts are problematic. It's not clear whether Libet talks about an urge or a desire or an intention, and that then there's the readiness potential is very problematic. And then there's this thing where how he timed movement onset, this thing called the W time. So there's I once wrote a small review about all the problems in that. There was some years back, again with Liad and Ram Rivlin, and I think Gideon was also there and some others for a book by Al Mealy. And we're now writing actually another one that's spearheaded by Mark Hallett from the NIH. But basically, the W time is a really problematic measure of intention onset or whatever it measures. So nothing much survives when you try to scrutinize the Libet experiment. But still, the field in some sense was made by this experiment. So that's my take.
Right.
Yeah. Well, would you be willing to make a prediction here? Like, where do you predict will be the interesting developments or the areas of science that would be most fruitful for philosophers interested in free will to explore?
Right. Well, I mean, I'm a neuroscientist sitting in a department of psychology, so I guess that's what I know better, those fields of science. So I think some places where exciting things might be coming, there are now more and more experiments that are done in what's called real time. So the idea is that you do some kind of sometimes quick and dirty, sometimes not analysis on the fly. So you record, let's say, neural data, and then you can use that data to change something in the environment as it happens. So to give you just an example, I mean, the whole idea with the Libet experiment is that you actually take the data, these EEG data that you recorded, you analyze it in the lab a few months later, and then you say, oh, a few months ago, if I was there, I could have predicted that the person's going to raise their right hand. But, that's a few months after. What if you could actually do it in an experiment? And again, it's not for lack of trying, but we have some hope that we could measure EEG better, or we could do it with intracranial recording. So now this is in patients undergoing some medical procedures if they're willing to take part in an experiment. With all those things, we could potentially do things on the fly as they happen. And I think that's where. So if you want to claim that I know what you're going to do before you know about it, it really gets exciting if I can really know in real time. I know right now that you're going to do that, and I read it like a magician. I read it on a piece of paper, and then a second later you do it, and I just show you my piece of paper, right?
Right.
So that's one place. We also have an increasing ability to record from more and more neurons in first of all in the living human brain. So again, these are usually patients that have that they need brain surgery for one reason or another, or sometimes they actually have brain surgery because they're, let's say, tetraplegic or something like that, and we do that to try to get them to control the machine directly with their mind or with their brain. There's also the experiments with animals that, again, you could record more and more neurons, and I think and you could record neurons and you could interfere with a lot of brain activity, and I think a lot of interesting things are going to happen there. So, and when you do these very complex experiments that you work with a patient, you only have so many patients and so on. it's really important to get the experiment right. It's really important to get the question that you're asking right. Because again, you could do this thing and these are really expensive experiments. And then, a few $1 million later and 10 years later, you realize that you didn't ask the right question. So I think that's, again, a place where philosophers and neuroscientists really have a place to work together. Again, these are just some thoughts. There are other places.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Uri, for joining us, and thanks for giving us so much of your time. We always ask at the end of our interviews where listeners can go to follow your work. Are there any projects that are forthcoming that you want to plug, or do you have a website you can share?
So you can find my work specifically if you look at the Brain Institute at Chapman University. You Google that up, you're going to see, I think it's braininstitute.us. And you can find more specifically my work. You can keep track of this work on the Neurophilosophy of Free Will project that I mentioned. There's a website. It's neurophil-free will, so neurophil-freewill.org. That would take you. There's a lot there. There are movies. There are interviews. There are seminars. There's actually quite a bit of things there. There's competitions that are coming up and so on. And in November, this group of the 17 neuroscientists and philosophers have jointly written a book that I think is probably going to be interesting for your listeners. It came from actually the initial idea came from Walter Sinnott Armstrong, and Walter and I ended up editing this book. And the idea is that we asked the neuroscientists, what are the questions you would most like to ask philosophers about free will? And you might expect neuroscientists ask, like, what is free will? What is will? What is freedom? Is there any neuroscientific experiment that you think could shed light on the, and things like that? And then we asked the same thing of the philosophers. What would you most like to ask scientists? So, some questions about mechanism, some questions about how can theoretical models can theoretical models of free will exist? What does that mean? And so on. So basically, we had a bunch of questions, I think about something like 30 to 50 for each discipline. And then the consortium members voted on the top 15. And then we assigned each one of those to a person to write a chapter on. And these are brief chapters, they're a few pages long. They're not, the idea is to do it like nice and snappy. Then people could ask follow-up questions. And then the authors of the chapters answered those. And that became this book. So I think to a great extent, we can say that these are really the questions that people in both fields most wanted the answers to. It's going to come out in November, or at least it's planned to come out in November by Oxford University Press. So I think this might be of interest to your listeners.
Yeah,
great.
We'll make sure to put all that in the show notes. Thanks again, Uri. For those who enjoyed hearing from a brain scientist in today's episode, we have good news. In our next episode, we will talk to neuroscientist Peter Ulrich, professor of psychological and brain sciences at Dartmouth College.